The frost came early that October, the kind that cracked the mud into hard little ridges before the leaves had even finished turning, and the old man walked his 2 worst acres the way he walked everything now, slow, favoring the left knee, cane sinking into the ground with each step like he was testing ice on a pond. The land had been in his family since before the war, though which war nobody in town bothered to specify anymore. Vietnam had left him with a knee full of gravel and a habit of counting things twice, and 30 years of Ohio winters had left the back 2 acres of his farm heaved and buckled, useless for anything but growing rocks and regret. He stood at the fence line most mornings, with his coffee going cold in a dented thermos cup, looking at that ruined ground the way another man might look at a debt he owed. The rest of the farm limped along well enough. A few hogs, some hay, a garden by the house that fed him through summer, but those back acres had beaten every plan he'd ever put to them. Corn wouldn't take. Beans rotted in the standing water come spring thaw. Even the weeds seemed half-hearted out there, thin and yellow, like they knew better than to try. It was the 3rd week of October when he drove into town for feed and passed the glass plant on County Road 9, the one that had been stamping out window panes and storm doors since before he'd shipped out. A dump truck sat idling at the loading dock, its bed heaped with sheets of glass, cracked corners, warped edges, panes gone milky or bubbled where the tempering had failed. He'd seen that truck before, always heading the same direction, out past the county line to the landfill trench where the plant paid by the load to bury what it couldn't sell. He parked his truck at the dock without really deciding to, the way a man's hands sometimes know something before his head does. The foreman, a heavy-set fellow named Duke Halverson, who ran the loading crew, came out wiping his palms on a rag and squinted at the old man like he was trying to place him. "Help you with something?" "That glass," the veteran said, nodding toward the truck bed. "Where's it headed?" "Ground, same as always. Costs us to bury it, if you can believe that." The old man was quiet a moment, doing the kind of arithmetic he'd learned to do in a jungle a lifetime ago, weighing risk against need, waste against want, what a man could carry against what a man could not afford to lose. "What if I hauled it instead?" he said, "saved you the burying." Halverson laughed, not unkindly, the way you'd laugh at a child asking to keep a stray dog. "You want broken glass. What in God's name for?" The veteran didn't answer right away. He was already looking past the man, past the truck, toward those frost-heaved acres waiting behind his own fence line, empty and patient as a held breath. "For growing things," he finally said. "Under glass, cold frames, maybe a hoop house, if I can rig it right." Halverson's laugh came again, bigger this time, and 2 younger men unloading pallets nearby turned to see what was funny. "Under glass," Halverson repeated, like he was tasting the words and finding them sour. "Mister, that glass is cracked, warped. Half of it's got the wrong tint from a batch that ran hot. We can't even sell it as scrap. It's that bad. You'd be better off with a tarp. Tarp won't hold heat the same." "Heat for what? Nothing grows in this county till May, and you're out on that stretch past the county road, aren't you?" "I've seen that ground. Nothing's grown there since Eisenhower." The old man didn't argue the point. He'd learned long ago that arguing with a man who hadn't yet seen the proof was like arguing with weather. You could shout at a storm all you wanted, but the only thing that changed its mind was time. "I'll trade you for it," he said instead, "whatever this week's load is, and whatever comes after, so long as you're paying to bury it. I'll work off the hauling and the loading myself. Save you the trench costs, save you the fuel for the county dump run." Halverson looked at him harder now, some of the amusement draining out of his face and something more careful moving in behind it. Men who'd worked docks and yards their whole lives could smell a real offer from a foolish one, and though this one still sounded strange, it didn't sound foolish. "A week's labor," Halverson said slowly. "For glass we're already paying to get rid of. That's the offer. You know the plant's insured different if you're not on payroll. You go and cut your hand open on a piece of this. That's your business, not ours. I've had worse than a cut hand." Something in the way he said it, flat, unbothered, a man reciting an old fact rather than making a boast, made Halverson glance down at the leg the old man favored, the way he stood with his weight shifted just slightly, the way his jacket hung a little looser on one shoulder than the other. Whatever question rose up in the foreman's mind, he didn't ask it. Instead, he spat once to the side, wiped his palms on the rag again, and said, "You're serious. I don't come to town for jokes." Halvorsen looked back at the truck bed, at the dull glitter of cracked panes stacked like broken ice, then out past the lot toward the road that led to the veteran's place, though he couldn't have known yet what waited at the end of it. 2 acres of frost-heaved dirt, and a man who'd already decided what he meant to build there before anyone gave him permission to try. Halvorsen turned the rag over in his hands one more time, folding it into a smaller square as if the motion helped him think. Behind him, through the wire mesh windows of the plant, the furnace glow pulsed against the grimy glass like something breathing. A shift bell rang somewhere deep in the building, muffled and far off, and neither man moved for it. "A week," Halvorsen finally said. "That's what I'm offering. You come in mornings, you haul, you sweep, you load the truck when Delbert's out sick, which he is more than he ought to be. You do that for a week, and I'll let you take what's going in the trench Friday instead of Monday. That's the whole deal. I ain't paying you cash, and I ain't putting your name on any form." "Didn't ask for cash." "No, you asked for glass. Nobody in his right mind wants." Halvorsen shook his head slowly, more to himself than to the old man in front of him. "You know what that ground of yours looks like from the county road? Everybody does. Frost heaves it every winter till it looks like a washboard. My daddy tried corn out there 30 years back before it was yours. Didn't take. I'm not planting corn. Didn't figure you were. Didn't ask what you were planting neither. Not my business." He said it the way a man says something he doesn't quite believe, leaving the door open just enough for the old man to walk through if he wanted to. The veteran didn't take the bait. He only nodded once, slow, the kind of nod that closed a conversation rather than continued it, and reached out his hand. Halvorsen looked at the hand for a moment, weathered, the knuckles swollen with old work, a thin white scar running along the base of the thumb, and then shook it, quick, like he was afraid something might rub off. "Monday, then," the foreman said. 6 sharp. Don't be late and don't expect me to hold your hand through it. Some of the boys are going to think this is the funniest thing they've seen all year. Let them think what they want. Thinking's free." That got something close to a laugh out of Halvorsen, short and surprised, gone as quick as it came. He turned back toward the loading bay, already calling out to someone inside about a broken pallet jack, and the old man stood a moment longer by the truck bed, looking down at the panes stacked there dull and lightless in the gray afternoon. He ran 2 fingers along the topmost sheet, feeling the hairline crack beneath the grime, the way it caught the light unevenly, like a scar healed wrong. Then he climbed into the cab, started the engine with a cough of blue smoke, and pulled out past the gate onto the county road, past the feed store, past the diner, where a waitress paused mid-pour to watch him go, past the bank where a teller mentioned to a customer that Wendell Rook had been seen up at the glass plant, of all places, talking to Halvorsen like he had business there. By supper, half the town would know something was stirring, though not one of them would guess what. The truck rattled home slower than it had come, the extra weight of nothing at all pressing on the old man's mind more than any load ever had. He turned it up the long, rutted drive as the light went the color of dishwater, and there was the field waiting for him, silent and frost-heaved, the same 2 acres that had beaten every planting he'd tried since he came back from the war, with a bad hip and a habit of counting his blessings out loud so he'd believe them. He parked by the barn and sat a long moment with his hands on the wheel, feeling the ache settle into his knee the way it always did when the day turned cold and he'd asked too much of it. He didn't go in for supper right away. He walked the field first, the way he did most evenings, stepping over the same stones he'd stepped over 100 times, running his palm along the split-rail fence that marked where his land gave up on being anything at all. He tried to see it the way Halverson had looked at those panes, dull, cracked, worth nothing to anyone with sense. Then he tried to see it the way he'd learned to see things a long time ago, in a place where a man who threw away what still worked did not last long. A bent nail could hold a roof. A cracked pane could still bend light. The question was never whether a thing was broken. The question was what it could still be made to do. Inside, he lit the stove and heated the last of the coffee, and while it warmed, he took out a pencil and the back of an old feed receipt and began to draw, not neatly, not the way an engineer would, but the way a man draws who has built things with his hands his whole life and trusts them more than paper. Low frames first, waist high, angled to catch the winter sun low in the south. Then something bigger, if the wood held out, if the panes held out, if his knees held out. He wrote numbers in the margins and crossed half of them out. Word had already started moving through town by then, the way it always did, a man seen at the glass plant, a man hauling nothing home, a man who by all rights should have given up on that field years ago. At the diner someone said he'd finally lost his good sense. At the feed store someone said losing sense was the least of what that field would take from him. But down at the plant, past midnight, the trench where they usually dumped the rejects sat half empty, and Halverson stood looking at it a while before he flicked his cigarette down into the mud and walked back inside, saying nothing to anyone about what he was thinking. The frost came early that year, settling into the low field before the rest of the county had even brought in its pumpkins, and he worked through it the way he worked through everything. Slow, deliberate, one task laid flat before the next began. He started with the posts, sinking them into ground that fought him at every turn, rocky and stubborn where the water table sat too close to the surface. His knees told him to stop by 10 in the morning most days, but he'd learned long ago that a body's complaints were just information, not orders, and he kept moving with the particular economy of a man who had rationed his strength before and knew how far it could stretch if handled right. The panes came off the truck in batches, and he handled each one like it might be the only glass he'd ever get, running his thumb along the cracks to feel which way they'd give before he cut them down to size with a glazier's cutter he'd bought second-hand from a hardware store 2 towns over. Some broke wrong and he set them aside for smaller frames. Some held true and those went into the bigger sections, the ones he was building for what he still only half believed might become a proper greenhouse before the year turned. His neighbor came by once, leaning on the fence the way men did when they wanted to look casual about their curiosity, and watched him tar a seam between 2 mismatched panes without saying much beyond a comment on the weather. But the look on his face said what his mouth wouldn't, that this was a man watching another man dig his own grave slow, board by board, pane by pane. Word of that visit made it to the diner before supper, embellished the way these things always were, and by the next morning half the counter had an opinion about the veteran and his glass field that they hadn't earned by lifting a single one of the panes themselves. He didn't go into town much through November. He'd catch the weather report on the radio in the mornings, jot the numbers down in a little notebook that had once held nothing but grocery lists, and match them against what he remembered of countless mornings standing watch, waiting for conditions to shift, learning the particular language of cold before it arrived. The frames grew, ugly and patched and held together with more faith than carpentry. But they grew, and by the time the first hard freeze came through and killed off the last stubborn tomato vines in every open garden for 20 miles, his low frames already had seedlings tucked warm beneath their cracked and crooked glass, breathing out their small green defiance into air that, by any reasonable expectation, should have already killed them. The frost that year came in like an army moving at night, quiet and total, laying its white weight over every fence post and rooftop before dawn broke. He was out before the sun, same as always, moving down the rows of low frames with a broom handle in his good hand, tapping the glass gently to knock the rime loose so the weak winter light could still get through. His knees screamed at him with every bend, the old shrapnel scars aching the way they always did when the temperature dropped, but he had learned decades ago that pain was just information, not an instruction to stop. He worked the frames like a man checking on sleeping children, lifting a corner here, tucking a scrap of burlap there, murmuring to the seedlings the way some men talk to engines or horses. The tomatoes he'd started from saved seed were leggy and stubborn, reaching for light that barely existed, but they were alive, and alive was the only argument he needed. The greenhouse, patched and ugly as a quilt made from mismatched shirts, held its heat better than he'd dared hope. He'd banked the north side with straw bales scavenged from a neighbor's burn pile, and he ran a small kerosene heater on the coldest nights, watching it the way he'd once watched a perimeter, never trusting it to burn unattended, never trusting the dark to stay honest. Some mornings he'd wake at 3, some old instinct pulling him out of bed before the alarm, and he'd walk out to the glass field in his coat over his pajamas, just to put his palm flat against a pane and feel whether the cold had won anything overnight. It never had, not yet. Word had gotten out, the way word always did in a county that small, that the crazy veteran's garden hadn't died. A few men drove by slow on the county road, craning their necks to see the frames glinting under frost, like something out of a dream nobody wanted to admit was working. Nobody stopped to ask him how. Pride was a strange, stubborn crop of its own, and it grew thick in that soil. But he noticed the trucks slowing, and he noticed the quiet, and he understood both without needing anyone to say a word. By the second week of December, when the school called the diner to ask if there'd be any fresh greens for the January lunch menu, or if they should just plan on canned again, the diner owner picked up the phone and, without much confidence, tried a number scrawled on a matchbook a customer had given her weeks back. The number for a man everyone in town had laughed at, but nobody, as far as she knew, had actually asked for anything yet. The phone rang twice before he answered it, wiping his hands on a rag that had once been a flannel shirt, his knee aching from an hour of kneeling in the frame rows, checking for slug damage that never seemed to come. The diner owner's voice on the other end was careful, almost apologetic, the way people talked when they weren't sure if they were about to be laughed at themselves. She asked if he had anything green, anything at all. The school was asking, and she didn't want to promise what she couldn't deliver, but she'd heard things, and she figured it couldn't hurt to ask. He stood there a moment with the receiver against his ear, looking out the kitchen window at the glass frames catching the low winter light, rows of spinach dark and glossy under the panes like something private the earth was still keeping. He told her he'd have a basket ready by Thursday. Nothing more, no boasting, no explaining how, just a number and a day. The same flat certainty he'd have used calling in a supply drop decades before, when the only thing that mattered was whether the thing you promised showed up when you said it would. Thursday came cold and windless, the kind of stillness that let frost sit thick and undisturbed on every surface that wasn't protected. He walked the rows before dawn with a lantern, breath fogging, knees complaining with every bend, and cut spinach leaf by leaf into a bushel basket lined with an old feed sack. He added a second basket of lettuce, the leaves tight and pale green, and because the tomato vines had thrown a few early blushed fruits ahead of schedule, he added those too, wrapped in newspaper so they wouldn't bruise on the drive. The truck complained getting started in the cold, same as it always did, but it caught, and he drove into town with the baskets riding in the bed under a scrap of tarp, past the feed store where men were already gathering with their coffee, past the bank with its dark windows, past the auction yard sitting silent and frozen. Nobody flagged him down. Nobody asked him to stop. But he saw heads turn at the sight of green leaves stacked in the truck bed in the dead of December, and he kept his eyes on the road and let them look. The diner owner met him at the back door, and when she folded back the newspaper and saw the tomatoes, red and unbroken, she went quiet for a long moment before she found her voice again, asking him, almost in a whisper, how much she owed him, and whether there'd be more next week. Wendell told her there'd be more next week, and the week after that, as long as the weather held and the coal stove didn't quit on him, and she nodded like she was trying to make the numbers work in her head before she'd even counted the money in her apron. She paid him in full, no haggling, and added a little extra folded into the bills that he didn't ask about and she didn't explain. He drove home with the empty baskets rattling in the bed and the sun climbing low and pale over the frozen fields, and for the first time since the pains had gone up along his fence, he let himself feel something close to satisfaction instead of just relief. The school called 2 days later, not the diner owner passing word along this time, but the cafeteria manager herself, a heavy-set woman with a clipboard voice who'd heard about the vegetables from her sister who worked the counter at the diner. She wanted to know if he could supply enough greens for the lunch program, at least through the worst of the season, since the truck that usually hauled produce up from downstate had been delayed twice already by ice on the interstate, and the kids were eating canned beans more often than anyone liked. Wendell said he'd see what the beds could give. And he meant it honestly. He wasn't going to promise more than the glass could grow. He spent that evening walking the rows with a lantern, counting heads of lettuce, checking the spinach for tenderness, running his thumb along the tomato vines to see how many more fruits were still holding green and firm. The panes above him held the day's warmth like a held breath, fogged faintly at the corners, and outside, past the tar-sealed seams, the wind picked up hard enough to rattle the loose lath he hadn't gotten around to replacing. He made a note to fix it before the week was out. A man couldn't afford a crack now, not with people counting on what grew inside. Word moved through the county the way it always did, slow and then all at once. A woman at the feed store saying she'd heard the old veteran was feeding half the town out of a glass shack held together with tar. A man at the auction repeating it with a laugh that didn't quite land the way it used to. Nobody had come to see it themselves, not yet. But the questions were changing shape, softening at the edges, curiosity working its way in under the mockery, like water finding a crack. Wendell didn't go looking for anyone to prove anything to. He filled the baskets, drove the same road, and let the empty diner counter and the school's canned beans speak for themselves. But out past the frost line, in town, someone was starting to wonder if maybe they ought to drive out and take a look for themselves. The truck that finally came wasn't from town at all. It rolled up his lane on a gray Tuesday morning, a county extension agent's sedan with a state seal on the door, mud already climbing the fenders from the last stretch of unplowed road. The man who stepped out wore a wool coat too clean for a farm visit and carried a clipboard like it was armor. He'd heard rumors, he said. wanted to see the operation himself before he wrote anything down. Wendell didn't ask who'd sent him. He just held the greenhouse door open and let the warm, green-smelling air answer for him. The agent stood a long while just looking. Rows of spinach, dark and heavy-leafed, tomato vines already knuckle-high and tied to old broom handles, the whole space breathing heat back at the cold outside like it didn't know what month it was. He crouched down, touched the soil, touched a leaf, said nothing for a full minute. Then he asked how. Not why. How. What was holding the heat when the panes were cracked, warped, a dozen different tints of glass never meant to sit together? Wendell told him plain. Tar in the seams, lath doubled where the wind hit hardest, low beds banked with straw and old feed sacks, and a stove he tended morning and night like a man tends a fire he can't afford to lose. Nothing clever, just care. Repeated enough times it started to look like a system. The agent wrote for a long time, asked about yields, about what he'd sold, to who, for how much. Wendell answered without pride and without shrinking either. The diner counter, the school lunch line, the same numbers he'd have given anyone who asked. When the agent finally straightened up, his coat had dark patches at the knees from crouching in the wet floor, and he looked, for a moment, almost embarrassed. He said he'd be writing this up. Said folks at the county office weren't going to believe a jury-rigged glass shack was out producing established growers with real equipment, real capital, real everything. But the numbers were the numbers, and he'd never seen a February garden like it in 15 years of driving this county. Wendell just nodded, not chasing the compliment, not needing it. He walked the man back out, past the cold frames, past the tomato beds, past the row of lettuce heads fat and green against the frost outside the glass. The agent paused at his car door, looked back once at the whole strange structure, glinting dull in the gray light, tinted panes catching what little sun there was. Somebody, he said, was going to want to see this for themselves before the season was out. Wendell only shrugged and went back to his stove, because there was still tar to check, and lath to fix, and baskets to fill before the diner opened. The county agent's word traveled faster than anyone expected. Within a week, a photographer from the regional paper showed up in a car too clean for the mud lane leading to the fence, asking to take pictures of what he kept calling the miracle garden, though there was nothing miraculous about tar and lath and a man who checked his seams every morning before the sun was up. He stood the old veteran beside a row of lettuce and told him to smile, and the veteran obliged for half a second before going back to work, because standing still for pictures wasn't something he had patience for when there was watering to do. The photograph ran on a Thursday. By Friday, the diner had a line out the door of people who wanted to see, with their own eyes, where the greens on their plates had come from. The owner didn't mind one bit. Business was business, and she'd tell anyone who asked that the old man's spinach was the best she'd served in 30 years of running that counter. She started keeping a little chalkboard by the register, "Today's greens from Rook Farm," and people read it like it meant something, because by then it did. The school lunch program called again, this time not to ask for a favor but to ask for a contract, regular deliveries, set price, paperwork with his name typed clean at the top. He sat at his kitchen table that evening with the papers spread out under the lamp, reading each line twice the way he read everything, and when he signed it, his hand didn't shake, though something in his chest did, some old tightness easing loose after years of scraping by on whatever the land and his pension allowed. Word reached the feed store before he ever set foot in it again. The clerk who used to snicker behind the counter now asked him, straight-faced, whether he'd consider selling some of that tar sealant trick to other men wanting to winterize their sheds. The veteran said he'd think about it, though he had no plans to. Not yet. He wasn't in the business of teaching lessons. He was in the business of keeping a promise to soil nobody else wanted, glass nobody else would touch, and a season that had nearly broken him twice before it finally bent his way. Still, some nights, sitting on the porch with his knee aching worse than usual in the cold, he'd look out at the greenhouse glowing faint under a late moon and think that the hardest winter he'd ever farmed was also, strange as it sounded, the first one that had ever felt like enough. The plant foreman came around again in late March, not with a truck full of rejects this time, but with his own 2 hands, asking if he could look through the greenhouse before the spring rush started. He walked the rows slower than he had the first time, bending to touch the tomato leaves like he was checking for a fever, running his thumb along a seam where tar had cracked and been patched twice over. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The old man could see him doing the arithmetic in his head, counting the panes, counting the months, counting what the plant had thrown away against what stood glowing green in front of him. Before he left, he asked whether the offer still held. The extra rejects, the ones from the new run coming in April, the batch with the color streak nobody at the plant could sell. The old man said it did. Same terms as before if the foreman wanted them, though he figured by now the foreman knew there wouldn't be any hauling this time. He'd bring them himself, in his own truck, on his own gas, and unload them by the fence without being asked. That was the difference nobody in town could quite explain when they talked about it later at the diner or the feed store. It wasn't that the glass had changed, it wasn't that the dirt had changed. It was that the men who'd laughed the loudest were the same ones now driving out past the county line just to see the frost still clinging to the fields around his greenhouse, while inside everything kept living. He didn't gloat. He never once brought up the article, the auction men, the banker who'd almost taken the North 42 winters back. He just kept doing the mornings the way he always had, checking the vents before sunrise, running his palm along the panes to feel for cold spots, writing the day's harvest in a notebook gone soft at the corners from handling. The discipline hadn't come from the garden. It had come from somewhere further back, some other winter, some other kind of cold he never talked about, and the garden had simply given it a place to live where it could do some good instead of just holding him together. Spring came on slow that year, the way it always did in that part of Ohio, with mud before green and false warmth before real. But inside the glass, none of that mattered. The rows kept climbing, steady and certain, while outside the fence, the whole county waited to see what he'd do next. The gate at the north fence took on a kind of steady traffic that spring, trucks pulling in slow off the county road, engines idling while men waited their turn without much talk. Word had gone around about the seedlings, tomatoes thick as pencils, peppers with true leaves already, cabbage starts that hadn't so much as flinched under the frost that killed everything 3 towns over. He sold them out of crates lined with damp newspaper, took cash or a promise scratched on a scrap of paper, never raised the price no matter how far a man had driven. The plant foreman came on a Tuesday, parking his truck off to the side, like he wasn't sure he belonged in the line. He stood with his cap in both hands, turning it slow, watching the old man wrap a dozen tomato starts in wet paper for a woman from 2 counties over. When his turn came, he didn't say much at first, just looked past the fence at the glass catching the morning light, rows of green standing tall where 2 winters back there'd been nothing but frost-heaved dirt nobody wanted. He asked, finally, whether the old man might want next year's rejects too. Said the plant had a new run of warped panes already stacking up in the yard, more than the trench could hold before summer. The old man didn't answer right away. He finished tying off the newspaper bundle, set it in the woman's arms, and only then looked over. Said he reckoned he could use them. Said the greenhouse could stand to be twice the size, if there was glass enough to make it so. That was all. No speech, no mention of the article or the auction or the bank. Just a nod, and a handshake that lasted the length of two old men agreeing on something that mattered more than either of them cared to say out loud. By the time the trucks thinned out that afternoon and the yard went quiet again, he walked the rows alone the way he always did, checking vents, running a palm along the glass for cold spots that weren't there anymore. The notebook in his coat pocket was near full, its corners soft from handling, its pages a record of every morning he'd shown up when no one asked him to. Outside the fence, the county went on the way counties do, forgetting quickly, moving on to the next thing to laugh about or admire. But the glass stayed standing, patched and crooked and ugly in places, holding warmth against a cold that had once seemed like it would win. And every February from then on, while frost lay heavy on every other field for miles, his rows kept climbing steady behind panes nobody else had wanted, proof enough that a man could build something lasting out of what the world had already thrown away.